Welcome back to our study in the book of Genesis, and we're looking at Genesis chapter 29. After 7 years, Laban deceived Jacob and gave him Leah instead of Rachel. After a week, Laban gave him Rachel also. Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah. He served Laban another 7 years for Rachel. Then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife, for my time is completed, that I may go into her." It's difficult to read this verse without concluding that there was a great deal of romantic passion in that 77-year-old man. His physical desire for Rachel is certainly to be expected. Ironically, it is this physical appetite, much like Isaac's desire for wild game, that caused Jacob to act too hastily and bind himself to a lifelong commitment. It says, "And Laban gathered all the men of the place and made a feast. Now it came about in the evening that he took his daughter Leah and brought her to him, and Jacob went into her. Laban also gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter Leah as a maid. So it came about in the morning that, behold, it was Leah. And he said to Laban, 'What is this you have done to me? Was it not for Rachel that I served you? Why then have you deceived me?' It was with great discretion that Moses has described this most delicate and intimate matter. Where Hollywood would have inserted pages of elaboration, Moses has given us a parenthetical statement about the maid which Laban gave his daughter. We must therefore deal with this subject in a manner which is consistent with the emphasis of the text and with the standards of righteousness. Weddings in that day involved a celebration that makes our weddings tame by comparison. We are accustomed to the wedding ceremony followed by a reception. In that day, the reception could last from several days up to a week. There was singing, there was celebration, there was honeymooning. For 7 years, Jacob had waited for this day. His eagerness is natural. It's normal. At the feast, Jacob may have had sufficient wine to somewhat dull his senses. The guests would be aware of his entrance into the tent and the matrimonial bed where Leah waited. Also his exit, thus indicated that the marriage had been consummated by the union of the bride and the groom. The same passion which dominated Jacob as he chose his bride now ruled as he entered into that tent. It's hardly a wonder that Jacob should have made the mistake that he did. When the next morning came, Jacob awoke with what a beautiful day, what a wonderful night, what an exciting adventure. What a shock as the sunlight burst into the tent to reveal that the woman in his arms was Leah, not Rachel. What irony that Jacob should repeat the identical words of Pharaoh to Abraham in almost the same expression of Abimelech to Abraham and Abimelech to Isaac. "What is this you have done to me?" While it's not recorded, it's easy to believe that Isaac also asked this of Jacob after his great deception. Jacob the trickster had been tricked. Jacob the heel grabber had been tripped up. Laban had slipped in the wrong daughter in the makings of this three-way romantic triangle. Laban was not taken back by Jacob's rebuke. He had probably planned his response to this question long before this confrontation took place. But Laban said, "It's not the practice in our place to marry off the younger before the firstborn. Complete the bridal week of this one, and we will give you the other also for the service which you shall serve with me for another 7 years. And Jacob did so, and completed her week, and he gave him his daughter Rachel as his wife. Laban also gave his maid Bilhah to his daughter Rachel for her maid. So Jacob went into Rachel also, and indeed he loved Rachel more than Leah. He served with Laban for another 7 years. Fewer passages contain more lessons for living than this chapter. Let me suggest some of these under several headings. The consequences of sin. Previously I've noted that one of the consequences of sin of Jacob's deceiving Isaac was his physical and emotional separation from those he loved. A second consequence is the moral parallel to Newton's law of motion. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. In our Lord's words, all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword. Jacob chose to get ahead in life by means of deception. Jacob learned the sad lesson that those who seek to deceive shall be deceived. The tragedy of this chapter is that all that took place was unnecessary. All we need to do is to contrast the acquisition of Rachel with that of Rebekah. The resources of Abraham made it possible for Isaac to have a wife in a very short period of time. One reason for this was the fact that the servant had the dowry from the riches of Abraham, Isaac's father. One of the consequences of Jacob's sin was he had to leave Canaan to flee empty-handed. Since Jacob sinned, he was separated from the wealth of his father and had only to work with his own hands. The 14 years of Jacob's labour would have been unnecessary had it not been for his deception of Isaac. Perhaps Isaac sent Jacob away without any of his wealth to teach him the value of hard work. Or perhaps it was to force Jacob to stay away a long time by working for a wife. This we do not know, but it does seem that this 14-year delay was unnecessary and purely the result of sin. What a price to pay. The grace of God. Some may view the events of this chapter as God getting even with Jacob. Others would merely interpret them as a kind of poetic justice, which is true in a way. But there's more. We can understand them as an evidence of the marvellous grace of God at work in the life of Jacob. God didn't allow these events to happen to punish Jacob, but to instruct him. Punishment has been borne by our Saviour on the cross, but discipline is the corrective training which furthers us on the path leading to godliness. Jacob learned the value of convention. The agreement which regulated the use of the well seemed to mean little to Jacob. In the excitement of meeting Rachel, he decided to use the well regardless of the rules for its use. He may also have disregarded some conventions in the way that he greeted Rachel. He certainly chose to disregard the convention of marrying the firstborn first. Laban was not telling Jacob anything new. He was reminding him of something that could not and should not be taken lightly or disregarded. In addition to all this, Jacob experienced the grace of God in the delay of 14 plus years. It was this delay which contributed to the preservation of Jacob's life by keeping him away from the anger of Esau, who had planned to kill him. Amazingly, the grace of God is manifested in this event by the gift of Leah as a wife to Jacob. This is probably the last thought to cross your mind, but I believe it's worthy of consideration. First, we must acknowledge that in the providence of God, and in spite of the deceptions of Laban, Leah was Jacob's wife. Notice, it was Leah, not Rachel, who became the mother of Judah, who was to become the heir through whom the Messiah would come. Also, it was Levi, a son of Leah, who provided the priestly line in later years. It also seems noteworthy that both Leah and her handmaiden had at least twice the number of children as compared to Rachel and her maid. The firstborn was always to have a double portion, and so it would seem Leah did, as so far as children are concerned. One final factor remains which shows the superiority of Leah to Rachel. Rachel dies at an early age, yet she was the younger sister. When she died, she was buried on the way to Bethlehem. When Leah died later, she was buried with Jacob in the cave at Machpelah. Leah was not a blight to Jacob, but actually a blessing. There's no doubt about what Jacob was guided more by his hormones than any other factor. He didn't pray about this matter, so far as we are told. He didn't give any consideration to matters of character. He didn't seek counsel. In fact, he sought to overturn the customs of the day and the preferences of Laban. We live in a very romantically orientated day. We find ourselves cheering for Rachel and booing Leah. God seems to have been on the other side. What is a romantic is not always right. Often it's wrong. Romanticism caused Jacob to use the well when and how he saw fit, regardless of the rules set by the owner. Romanticism led Jacob to choose Rachel, not Leah. Romanticism so controlled Jacob that under its spell he spent an entire night with the wrong woman. We must beware of those decisions which are ruled only by our feelings or romantic impressions or selfish desires. Beauty. Few things are as important to women today as beauty. Perhaps nothing is more important to men today than beauty. Rachel was a wonderfully endowed woman. There's nothing wrong with that. Sarah was beautiful. So was Rebecca. But outward beauty must always be considered a secondary consideration. Jacob looked at Rachel's exterior and investigated no further into her character. Charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised, the proverb says. The same theme is prominent in the New Testament, in Timothy and Peter. Our society has placed a premium on glamour and beauty. Much of our sense of self-worth is based upon our outward attractiveness and sex appeal. However, that is the wrong emphasis. Our ultimate worth is that estimation which comes from God. God was not impressed with Rachel's good looks. God looked upon the heart and blessed Leah. Her worth, while never fully realized by her husband, was great in the eyes of God. May all of us learn to be content with ourselves as God made us, and may we find our real worth in the realm of the Spirit. But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look at his appearance or the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For God sees not as men see. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." As we read of Jacob's life during these years, we find ourselves wondering what God is doing in his life. We read of his growing prosperity, and we're not quite sure if it is God is blessing him or if his success is a result of his own conniving and scheming. We read of no ladders from heaven. We see no altars being built. There are no messages from the Almighty. It's almost as though heaven has grown silent. A study of love, sex, marriage and children. The story of Jacob's marriage and family life leaves a great deal to be desired. In fact, our passage reads much more like a modern-day soap opera. The story told is one of competition between two women and their maids, which results in Jacob being shuttled from bedroom to bedroom, from tent to tent. Modern-day soap operas deal with a very similar kind of plot. However, God's soap is not intended to encourage us to think sinful thoughts or to commit illicit acts, but rather to challenge us to clean up our own acts and to live righteously before him. Let us remember that Jacob is, at this point in time, living outside the land of promise. While God has promised his presence, protection, and provision, he is also at work in Jacob's life to purge out many of the sinful patterns that have characterized him in the past. Consequently, while God is with Jacob, all does not go well with him in these days. Many of the consequences of his previous sins catch up with him. His choice of Rachel on primarily physical grounds, his insistence that he have her even after he has married Leah, leads to a most distressing home and family life. As we approach this passage, we need to be aware of the fact that Moses has not arranged the events chronologically, but actually topically. With only a little simple mathematics, we can quickly see that too many children are born in these verses to have been born one after the other. There must have been some overlap in the births. It becomes apparent that in the history of births, the intention to arrange them according to mothers prevails over the chronological order. So that it by no means follows that because the passage says when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, occurs after Leah had 4 sons. Therefore, it was not till after the birth of Leah's 4th child that Rachel really became aware of her own barrenness. By arranging the births as he has, Moses enables us to feel more intensely the division, the competition, between Leah and Rachel. We read these verses like someone watching a tennis match. We look first at one contestant, then at the other, and so on. That is just the way this account is written, so we might be able to identify with these two women, both of whom desperately want to be assured of Jacob's love and affection. In her early years of child rearing, we find Leah at the high point of her spiritual life. God's loving intervention in her life is evident to her, and she gratefully acknowledges it. 29:31-32 says, Now the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, and he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. Leah conceived and bore a son and named him Reuben, for she said, Because the Lord has seen my affliction, surely now my husband will love me. What a pathetic predicament Leah is in. She's married to a man who never wanted her for a wife, and who refuses to give her the love she desperately needs. God lovingly reached out to Leah by giving her a much desired son, Reuben. Reuben means something like sea, a son. It was a great joy for Leah to be able to provide Jacob with a man-child who would become his heir. This child kindled Leah's hope of being loved by Jacob, whose love for Rachel was so strong that he hardly acknowledged Leah's existence. The barrenness of Rachel at least drove Jacob to the tent of Leah to provide himself with sons who would prosper him. Leah's hope for a small portion of Jacob's affection were not realized, as is seen by response to her second son's birth. Then she conceived again, and bore a son, and said, Because the Lord had heard that I am unloved, he has therefore given me this son also. So he named him Simeon. No change in Jacob's attitude or actions has been seen by Leah, and so when the second son was born, she acknowledged the child as the tender response of a loving God who knew the very thoughts of her heart. The name Simeon, he hears, gave testimony to Leah's awareness of the grace of her God. With the birth of her third son, Leah's hopes for Jacob's tenderness and affection was once again aroused. She conceived again and bore a son, and said, Now this time my husband will become attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore he was named Levi. 2 things have changed since the birth of Reuben, the firstborn. First, Leah has now provided Jacob with 3 sons, not just 1. The mere quantity of children she has borne him should impress Jacob with her value to him, especially since Rachel had produced none. Second, her hopes had become much more realistic. She no longer aspires to the high level of love which Jacob had for Rachel, but merely for the attachment which any man should have for a wife who is so fruitful. If we understand the words correctly, the attachment which Leah desires is not so much that of affection, but even of obligation. How can Jacob not feel more kindly towards her because of these 3 sons she has given him? While 3 sons did little to change Jacob's heart, the birth of the 4th was the occasion for Leah's most devout expression of praise and thanksgiving towards the God who had heard her prayers. Leah conceived again and bore a son, and said, This time I will praise the Lord. Therefore she named him Judah. Then she stopped bearing. Previously, Leah had been grateful to God for the children he had given, but uppermost in her thoughts was the effect this might have upon Jacob. She sought his love so desperately. The pinnacle of Leah's piety was that point at which she came to recognize that to be loved and led by God was a far greater thing than to be loved by any man. While Jacob's affection was still something she greatly desired, she was content with the abundant love of God. In him she was abundantly blessed. To him she would give praise. And thus it was that the name Judah, which in effect meant praise the Lord, was given the 4th son. Praising God was easy for Leah with 4 sons at her side. However, seeing her sister's blessing only aroused jealousy in Rachel. Now when Rachel saw that he bore Jacob no children, she became jealous of her sister, and she said to Jacob, "Give me children, or else I die." And Jacob's anger burned against Rachel, and he said, "Am I in the place of God who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" On this occasion, neither Rachel nor Jacob responded in what we call a pious manner. Rachel, desperately jealous of Leah's fruitfulness, demanded children of Jacob. Rather than recognize her barrenness as coming from the hand of God, she sought to shift the blame to Jacob. It was all his fault, she insisted. Jacob didn't respond well to this kind of demand. Jacob's attitude is suspect. His hot response seems far removed from true righteous indignation. It sounds far more like one of outrage. "Don't blame me for your barrenness. Blame God." A demand struck hard at Jacob's virility and male ego, so Jacob struck back just as fiercely. The fact he employed spiritual language and used God to rebuke her doesn't mean that his spirit was right in what he did. We often employ pious words to cut people to the quick. Like Rachel, Rebekah had been barren, but Isaac's response was quite different from Jacob's. Isaac prayed on behalf of Rebekah, and on his behalf God gave his wife children. No such prayers are mentioned here, nor are we told that God answered the prayers of Jacob. We're only told that God heard the petition of the wives. Elkanah gave Hannah special treatment and tenderness because of her inability to bear children, but Noah's gentleness characterizes Jacob. While we're told that Jacob had a great love for Rachel, it is not very evident at this difficult time in Rachel's life. Her jealousy implies that she lacked assurance of Jacob's love. She fears not having children, and because of that she makes a desperate proposal. She said, "Here is my maid Bilhah. Go into her, that she may bear on my knees, that through her I too may have children." So she gave him her maid Bilhah as a wife, and Jacob went into her. Bilhah conceived and bore a son, and Rachel said, "God has vindicated me and has indeed heard my voice and given me a son." Therefore she named him Dan. There are definite similarities between this proposal and that of Sarah in Genesis 16. Each intended to adopt a child born from the union of her husband and her maid, but here the similarity stops. Sarah made a proposal at a time when Abram had no children, while Jacob already had several sons through Leah before Rachel's proposal. While Sarah's proposal came from circumstances which seemed to demand desperate measures, Rachel's demand stemmed from her own pride and jealousy. She must have children of her own, and she would take any steps necessary to get them. The results were as Rachel had hoped. Her response to the birth of this boy sounded most spiritual. One would think Rachel had done the most wonderful and sacrificial thing in giving her maid to Jacob. Her words were intended to give credit to God for all that she and he had accomplished together. The name Dan meant judged. She claimed that God had judged the matter of a dispute with her sister Leah and had sided with her, as proven by the birth of this child. Nowhere are we told that God opened the womb of Bilhah. However, after all, wasn't the birth of a child the natural result of such union? Humanly speaking, God would have had to intervene into the normal course of affairs to have prevented this birth. But Rachel was anxious to claim God on her side. The statement made by Rachel on the occasion of the birth of Bilhah's second son is even more reflective of her true spiritual state. Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. So Rachel said, "With mighty wrestling I have wrestled with my sister, and I have indeed prevailed." And she named him Naphtali. Rachel saw herself in a great struggle, not with God, but with her sister. This she describes as a wrestling match which she won. Here God is neither mentioned nor praised. Rachel is preoccupied with a contest between herself and Leah, and she claims to have won that contest. How far Leah falls from her grateful acceptance of God's blessing in previous verses. Rachel, while undoubtedly wrong in proposing that Jacob sleep with Bilhah, at least can be understood to have been reacting to her barrenness. But Leah already has 4 sons of her own. There's no need to give her maid Zilpah to Jacob for a wife, other than the fact that this was what Rachel had done. Leah and Rachel are in a head-to-head confrontation. If Rachel can employ her maid in this contest, then so can Leah. When Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, she took her maid Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife, and Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, "How fortunate!" So she named him Gad. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. Leah said, "Happy am I, for woman will call me happy." So she named him Asher. Leah's speech betrays her here. Not once is God mentioned. In the fervent heat of this battle between 2 wives, little thought is given to the ethics of their actions, only to the expected results. She who previously had viewed her children as a gift from a gracious and caring God, now sees these sons as merely good fortune. How lucky I am! How fortunate! How happy am I! Religious devotion has been thrown to the wind. For anyone keeping score, Leah was ahead of Rachel 4-2, but that was not enough. Now she added 2 more points to the scoreboard. However, in the process of gaining ground in her sister, she has forfeited the godliness she once demonstrated. The focus of Leah's thinking has shifted from God's estimation of her actions to the praise she will be given by other women. Reuben's innocent discovery of an ancient love-producing potion provided the occasion for another confrontation and contest between Jacob's 2 wives. Now, in the days of the wheat harvest, Reuben went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." But Leah said to her, "Is it a small matter for you to take my husband? Would you take my son's mandrakes also?" So Rachel said, "Therefore he may lie with you tonight in return for your son's mandrakes." When Jacob came in from the field in the evening, then Leah went out to meet him and said, "You must come into me, for I have surely hired you with my son's mandrakes." So he lay with her that night, and God gave heed to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a 5th son. Then Leah said, "God has given me my wages, because I gave my maid to my husband." So she named him Issachar. Mandrakes were berries found in that part of the world which are thought to stimulate desire for lovemaking, and also to enhance the chances of conception. Leah was more interested in these berries for the former quality, Rachel for the latter. While temporarily not bearing children, Leah's greatest need was to get Jacob into a tent where nature could take its course. Rachel, on the other hand, had Jacob with her nearly every night, but she seemed unable to become pregnant. We may tend to be amused at the credulity of these women who suppose that such a love potion would be of any benefit. However, before we become too smug, in our sophisticated and enlightened day, remember, millions, perhaps billions, are spent on cosmetics each year. Every day the toothpaste and the perfume commercials convince us that whiter teeth or cleaner breath or more come-hither perfume will do what nothing else can to enhance our love life. So you see, things have not really changed so much over the centuries after all. What a sad state of affairs Jacob's marriage had come to. He had so failed as a husband that his wife had to resort to a form of prostitution to purchase his services as her husband. Rachel was so lacking in faith that she put her trust in mandrakes rather than the God who made them. Rachel would appear attempting to produce sons like Jacob sought to produce sheep by the use of magical devices. Finally, Leah is reported to give birth to a 6th son and also a daughter. Then Leah said, "God has endowed me with a good gift. Now my husband will dwell with me because I have borne him 6 sons. So she named him Zebulun, and afterwards she bore a daughter and named her Dinah. The report of Dinah's birth is intended to introduce her to us in preparation for the tragic events of Genesis 34. Other daughters were born, but she is the one who receives the greatest attention. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. So she called his name Joseph. After all of Rachel's devices and schemes had been exhausted, yet without any children from her own womb, God grants her the desire of her heart. And God remembered Rachel, and God gave heed to her and opened her womb, so she conceived and bore a son. God has taken away my reproach. She named him Joseph. May the Lord give me another son. Prayer does not immediately occur to Rachel as a solution to her stigma of barrenness, but it does seem to be her last resort. We often leave prayer in the category of last-ditch action. The name Joseph is significant in two ways. The word asap has taken away has reference to the removal of the barrenness which has so plagued Rachel. A similar sounded word Yosef may add expresses the further hope of Rachel that she had been given the privilege of having yet another son to present to her husband. Leah also bore a daughter Dinah. Therefore within 7 years God had blessed Jacob with at least 12 children. Leah had borne 7, Bilhah 2, Zilpah 2, and Rachel 1. Joseph. It must have been nearly 7 years after marriage to Jacob that Rachel finally bore him a son. There may be significance to this delay. Jacob, due to his deception and deceit, was delayed in the process of getting a wife for himself. Only after all these futile attempts were thwarted and shown to be without result does God open Rachel's womb, and that may be the answer to her prayers. Rachel is yet to have another child, but he will come at the cost of her own life. The implications of this text are so numerous that we can only mention some and suggest that we give them some thought. The nation Israel, which first read this book from the pen of Moses, learned the wisdom of the law which forbade a man to marry a woman and her sister. Furthermore, this account of the origin of the 12 tribes of Israel must have proved to be most humbling to the nation, for it was hardly a story which inspired national pride. Perhaps at the time of the Exodus and during the days of the conquest of the land, the people began to think too highly of themselves. They might falsely have concluded that God had blessed them because of their greatness and noble roots. This story would serve to remind them that their roots were no basis for pride whatsoever. They must never trust in their heritage as the Jews of Jesus' day did, but trust in the God of their heritage. That is why God instructed them to recite the origins at the presentation of the first fruits. You shall answer and say before the Lord your God, my father was a wandering Aramean. He went down to Egypt and sojourned there, few in number, but there he became a great and mighty populous nation. We might be inclined to read this account of the struggles between Leah and Rachel and think of it as the long ago and the far away, and thus of little application to us. Such could not be further from the truth. There are differences between the culture of that day and our own, but, as someone observed, the only difference between the practice of Jacob in his day and that in our own is that he lived with 4 wives simultaneously, while we live with ours consecutively. We do with divorce what Jacob did with polygamy. A distinct cultural turnover in values has occurred since that day as well. Women of that era tended to determine their value on the basis of how many children they could produce for their husbands. This seems to underlie the words of Leah, happy am I, for women will call me happy. Nowadays, many women consider children a burden rather than a blessing. Children are considered a hindrance to fulfillment rather than its means. Consequently, birth control devices are thought to be the key to freedom. Abortion is a necessity for a woman's happiness. Life's meaning should not be equated with either Rachel and Leah were both in error by making a good gift from God, children, the ultimate touchstone of fulfillment and happiness. Leah was far closer to the truth at the time of Judah's birth, for then she looked to God for her worth, meaning and approval, rather than to any man, including her husband. A woman is special in the eyes of God and valued as an individual with great potential to make a difference in the world in which he lives. Her personality and ability to achieve a great personal spiritual relationship with God is evidenced by how many women are faithful worshippers compared with men. The influence that a woman can have both on her husbands and her children and her friends can never be underestimated. Many think today a career will bring us fulfillment. But no matter how hard we work, we're often treated as just a number and not truly valued, and can lose our jobs at a snap of a finger. Sex, love, family are meant to be enjoyed within the confines of the will of God and the Word of God, and ought to be complete in fellowship with Him. While love without sex may be frustrating, sex without love is stupidity. This is a lesson which we learn from Jacob. Surely these years with Rachel, where sex was not possible or permissible, were frustrating. But sex without love is just as bad. Jacob engaged with sex with his wife Leah, but there was no fulfillment in it. In fact, it degenerated to mere prostitution, where Leah had to purchase his presence. Do not think this kind of bargaining with sex occurred only in the distant past. In our present day, sex is often a commodity which is bargained for various considerations. That is mere prostitution. Sex without love is tragedy. Someone said whoever created men and women and sex must have been a very poor engineer. Men respond very quickly to physical stimuli. Women do not. Men reach the peak of their sexual desire early in life. Women later. Secular thinking would suppose that this is poor design, that man and woman should precisely correspond in these areas and other areas. Yet these differences are by good design. God made man and woman distinctly different, so that the ultimate in physical pleasure can only be obtained by a deliberate and conscious love which makes sacrifices of itself for the pleasures of the other. Without sacrifice, love making deteriorates into a mere self-seeking gratification at the expense of the other partner. Love and sex must go together. Neither sex nor children can create love. Leah would be quick to tell us that she learned no amount of sex could ever earn the love of her husband. Even after 6 boys, she was still unloved. Love cannot be manufactured through sex. Many prostitutes were driven to the profession by the feeling that they were unloved. All they had to give, they supposed, was their body. There are many marriages where the couple have very serious marital problems, and they decided to have children in order to hold the marriage together. This doesn't work either. For producing children doesn't produce love. The children are creators of love, but it's consumers. He or she who places sex on an extremely high level of priority becomes its slave. Jacob's love for Rachel seems to be largely based upon her physical attractiveness. Jacob appears to have been guided more by his hormones than anything else. Our society informs men and boys that their masculinity is largely indicated by the number of conquests they can make among women. The more they make, the more of the man they are. Jacob did rather well by these standards. Jacob circulated among his 4 wives frequently enough to produce a growing family. But look at what happened to him in the process. He's not the master of his harem. He was mastered by his harem. He was pushed from bed to bed by his wives. He was purchased for the night. The passivity of Jacob in these verses is an indication of his lack of leadership. He was a slave of sex and marriage, not its sovereign. If you got something out of this chapter, please feel free to come back and join us once again.